Hi everyone, welcome to Forbes Flash. Thanks for joining us and let's get started. We're starting off with a nice payday we can all be impressed with. This week, it was announced that billionaire Leslie Alexander will sell the Houston Rockets for $2.2 billion. He bought the team for just $85 million in 1993. Not a bad return on investment, right? The team will now be owned by fellow billionaire and Texan Tillman Fertitta, the owner of Golden Nugget Casinos. Here's the 3 things you need to know from this past week. Tech leaders from Bill Gates to Laurene Powell Jobs reacted to the news that the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or DACA, will be rescinded. Wednesday evening, Facebook billionaire Mark Zuckerberg hosted a Facebook Live from his home with 3 of the undocumented immigrants known as Dreamers. The almost hour-long broadcast was viewed by over 1 million people. We're going to fight alongside you to get this resolved to get a good outcome for all Dreamers and undocumented folks, said Zuckerberg. San Francisco-based sneaker startup Allbirds has raised $17.5 million in new investment, bringing their total funding to $27.5 million to date. The merino wool sneakers have a cult-like following in Silicon Valley, thanks largely to how comfortable they are. Your standard quick taxi trip might someday be a thing of the past, and a German startup just took a step closer to leading that charge. Lilium just raised $90 million to help get their electric mini jet service off the ground as soon as possible. They're not alone in trying to get this concept up and running. Larry Page and Uber are also racing to the sky. On the fence about joining us in Boston this October for our Under 30 Summit, we're continuing to announce new speakers as the event draws near. The latest, Olympic skier Lindsey Vonn and food and wine guru Lee Schwager. See the incredible lineup of speakers and music festival artists at Forbes.com/Boston. In the days following the landfall of Hurricane Harvey, stories of destruction and hope alike have emerged. Volunteers, often bonded together by chance, have stepped up to help others, and for many of them, tech has become a major factor for how they can help. An uplifting Forbes story this week highlights a volunteer rescue group who built what has become one of the central hubs for information on Harvey recovery, harveyneeds.org. These volunteers and more have begun to turn towards Florida and the impending Hurricane Irma to see where their rescue tech can continue to save lives. I'm here with Kelly Phyllis Erb, otherwise known as Tax Girl, who is a senior investing editor here at Forbes, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about our upcoming tax week next week. Tax Reform Week, right, is what it's called. So give us a little preview of what's coming.
Well, we're calling it Tax Reform Week, but that's kind of a misnomer because technically it's really going to be all about tax cuts. You probably heard that tax reform is in the news, and everybody keeps saying this is a big chance for tax reform because we have a president in the White House that says he wants it, and we have 2 houses of Congress that say that they want it, and it hasn't happened since 1986. But when you start looking at the numbers, realistically, I don't think it's going to happen in 2017 either. I think what we're going to see is tax cuts, and I think we're going to talk a lot about that in our package coming up.
So what's going to get cut?
Well, there's things that we know won't get cut, so you can breathe a sigh of relief because I'm pretty sure the home mortgage interest deduction isn't going anywhere, and the charitable deduction isn't going anywhere. Other than that, though, everything's kind of on the chopping block. And that's kind of what makes it all very interesting because there's a lot of like easy things that you could cut that might be good from a savings perspective, but you have people kind of screaming in the corner saying, but don't cut this because I like this. And a perfect example right now is the casualty loss deduction. A lot of people probably aren't familiar with it, but it's something that allows you to take a deduction when there's damage to your property if it's not insured.
Okay.
Normally, people would be all over that because why not? But with Harvey just hitting and Irma on the way, it's really not an opportune time for people in Congress to say that they're going to cut what is really a form of disaster relief. So other than, you know, that's exactly the kind of dilemma that they're facing on the Hill is that the easiest way to get tax reform is to make cuts. And I do think we'll see rate cuts, but in terms of like what's going to get cut in terms of like deductions and that kind of stuff, we're just not going to know. But fortunately, we have a lot of really smart people that are going to tell us what they think is going to happen. So it's pretty exciting from a tax perspective.
So talk through the numbers a little bit with me. You were telling me beforehand.
Right. So here's the big dilemma. Is right now, in terms of debt, we have about 77% of the GDP is debt, which is a huge number. And it's actually the highest it's been since right after World War II. So for a lot of people that want to politicize it and say this is something that's happened in the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, it's not. The debt has continued to skyrocket, and it's not going anywhere. So the challenge, of course, is to get that down. And how do you do that? Normally, you would increase taxes, which people don't want to have happen, or you'd cut spending, which is also a challenge right now because we're actually talking a lot about increasing certain kinds of spending. So that's really when you start looking at the numbers, like what gets cut, or do you make cuts? And if you decide that you're like just going to make cuts across the border, so we're going to give everybody a tax cut, like very Oprah, everybody gets a tax cut. Who actually gets those tax cuts? Because we have a Treasury Secretary who said that he would make sure that the wealthy don't disproportionately benefit from any kind of tax packages that come down the road. So when you start drawing those lines in the sand, you have again competing interests. You have people at the lower end that say that we are the ones who really want the tax cuts, but then there's other folks saying, but everybody needs to pay something. And then you have the middle class who typically get ignored, even though we talk a lot about middle class tax cuts. Middle class typically gets ignored in these arguments. So we'll have to see, what happens with middle class tax cuts. But I think that, when you start looking at the numbers, the suggestion is going to be that they're going to be really kind of directed towards the middle class and not towards the fringe.
So for the ordinary person who's thinking about their taxes coming up in a few months from now,
right,
what should they look out for next week?
Don't do anything. So this is my biggest piece of advice is not to do anything, because this happened before last year when they were talking about changing taxes and tax reform and tax cuts, and there were actually folks saying like maybe you shouldn't do anything. And then when it was tax season, there were actually suggestions that some of the tax cuts would be retroactive and that folks should actually make changes and maybe extend their tax forms waiting to see what happened. My sense is that no matter how many times people promise that we're going to get tax cuts through, I think that the timing is not right. Okay. So I wouldn't do anything. I would wait and see. And fingers crossed we have something by the end of the year, but I wouldn't count on folks rolling back into D.C. in the fall, having massive tax cuts and large tax reform and everybody, changing what they're going to be doing for next year. I think that any tax cuts that come down the road, I think are going to be pretty small. I don't think we're going to have any huge reform. I think if we do get something big, it's going to be things that aren't going to affect ordinary people. Like, for example, we might see a switch from a global tax system to a territorial system, and that's just a kind of a complicated way of saying that instead of getting taxed on your worldwide income, it would be where it's sourced. And we're one of a handful of countries that do that, and there's been a big push for us not to. And so that might change because it's something that corporations have been pushing for. But in terms of what are you going to see on your tax return, that's probably not going to affect the average person.
Okay, so folks should keep an eye out for this tax reform week.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of really good discussion. I think in terms of what we're going to see like long term, maybe there's not a lot there, but I think that at least for tax reform week, there's going to be a lot of good discussion about what should happen.
Great. Well, thank you so much for giving us a heads up, and stay tuned for it coming next week.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us. Tweet your feedback using #ForbesSplash, and we'll see you next week. Tune in every Friday morning, same time, same place.